Hi, this is Jurgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. Since you're here, you may as well join me on a little journey into the dark side of human nature. We seem to collectively be living in dark times, and there seems to be an assumption going on that our deep conflicts, our inability to get along, the reason why we seem so polarized is because we're so different. And I'm not so sure that that's really the case. I suspect that who you hate and on what grounds may reveal a lot about you fundamentally. Um, Having seen clients now professionally for the last 23 years, I think that if you really want to get to know someone, um, one of the best ways of doing that, of course, in addition to seeing how the person actually operates in multiple contexts in the world, is to have the person describe the world and to describe other people, and then quite simply do a U turn and apply that to the person. So let me start off with this little reflection. Um, I've seen a meme on Facebook recently that quite a few people have spread, and it was written by a person who said that in today's confusion around politics, she had found one surefire way of knowing that she was on the wrong track politically, and that was if she was ever surrounded by Nazis. Meaning, if Nazis ever shared her views, that was a surefire way of knowing that she was wrong. Now, from what I could see, it seemed as if, and I don't think many people would necessarily object to this, although I would, and I'll make the case for that in a little bit. Um, It seems to me that the person who wrote this had what you could call left wing socialist tendencies. And I'm going to make the assumption, based upon the people I saw who spread this meme, that most of the people who bother to spread it and who seem to resonate with it the most are probably people on the political left who more or less have a socialist orientation and who view the Nazis as people whose views and orientations are fundamentally different than their own. Now, here's the irony with this: Hitler was a socialist. We'll say that again. Hitler was a socialist. He ran a national socialist party. And not only did he and his party identify sincerely as socialists, but the relevant facts as to how they actually operated and what they stood for strongly supports that they were, in fact, socialists. So let's start with some basic facts. So I'll look at my red book of notes here a little bit. So in 1920, Hitler introduced to the Nazi Party a 25-point plan for National Socialism, right? And they called for the good of the community before the good of the individual. So I'm not that big of a fan of the whole left right divide in politics. I personally identify neither with the left nor the right. My preferences are pretty strongly libertarian. So I have a tendency to think in a different way, to think more in the direction of, a lot of freedom on the one hand and a lot of coercion and violence on the other hand. Collectivism and force on the one hand, individualism and voluntary choice on the so the good of the people of the community before the good of the individual. This is collectivistic thinking, not individualistic. That's your first hint. A couple of other things here. The state was to provide opportunity for livelihood and a way of life. So in Germany, in the late 30s, the state actually um, determined what kind of job you would have. So you were guaranteed a job, but the state would determine what kind of job you would have. And not even the employer or you yourself could voluntarily change jobs without a state bureaucrat sanctioning it. There were also, workers' camps in place. Let's see what else we had here. We demand the nationalization of all previous associated industries, trusts, and this is the essence of socialism: state ownership of the means of production. In Nazi Germany, um, private ownership was in name only. The state had unlimited central control of all economic decisions. And the state would decide what land were to be used for what purpose. So, for example, let's see here, the Minister of Economics in 1937 reported that Germany's export trade involved 40,000 separate transactions daily, yet for a single transaction, as many as 40 different forms had to be filled out. So the National Socialists of Germany hated capitalism. They hated anything that was about private profit. It was all for the collective. You had socialized medicine. You had pensions for the elderly. You had the state being responsible for a complete restructuring of the entire educational program. So this is as socialist as you can get. Of course, you had no free speech under the Nazis. You had no free press. So if we look at today, many of the people who are deemed to be the furthest away from the Nazis in conventional thinking, the radical leftists and the social justice warriors, I would make the argument that taking away the much of the racial hatred and the anti-Semitism, they have way more in common than actually separates them. Let's look at free speech to begin with. The bedrock of any free society, the bedrock of anything that's supposed to be uh, democratic, for example, the bedrock of science. Um, the Nazis did not allow free speech and did not allow the free press. If you look at the social justice warriors and the radical leftists today, barring the Islamists, no one else is attacking free speech as severely. If you look at academic institutions, Ivy League universities in the United States, with their safe spaces, their trigger warnings, their microaggressions, um, they're wanting to rewrite history and censor certain words in songs. Um, this is very similar. You look at the radical leftists and the social justice warriors, they hated capitalism, just like the Nazis. State ownership of the means of production. Um, the whole kind of tribalization of in-group, out-group, where the in-group is morally superior and the out-group is some sort of deplorable uh, deviant, where the in-group should have special rights based upon group membership at the expense of people of the outgroup. Of course, for Germans, it was the Jews and the cripples and everyone that didn't belong to the Aryan race. On the radical left these days, you have a victim oppressor type way of thinking where your virtue as a human being that does not come from how you as an individual operate in the world. It comes from your victim status as to which group you seem to belong to. So the worst thing, is probably to be a white middle-aged man like me. If you're a minority of some sort, you belong to a minority group such as a transsexual or let's say that you're a Muslim female or something like that, then you have a lot of credit. Of course, the great irony is that the individual is the smallest minority of all, and it's exactly that smallest minority that are willing to sacrifice on the altar of protecting so-called minority groups. Um, so, what I'm suggesting here is that these people have way more in common than they are actually different. And the more you emotionally get really, really fired up by what you see as out there, the more that might be an indicator that you might want to illuminate what's going on inside of you. I'll give you another interesting example of this. I went to a spiritual forum where they talked about the whole George Floyd case and Black Lives Matter and these sorts of things. And I asked two questions. I asked, based upon the video footage, before you tear down Western civilization and freedom of speech and rule of law and all these sorts of things, what evidence is there based upon the footage that the murder of George Floyd was racially motivated? Of course, there was no such evidence. And a lot of people, they're freaked. And they called me a white supremacist, a racist. I also questioned um the claims of systemic racism. That, for example, the United States is a country where law enforcement is steeped in systemic racism. And I, of course, don't know, but I looked at some of the figures, and it turns out that more black people are shot by black police officers than white police officers. And that by and large, you're more likely to get shot as a white person by the police. Um, and get fatally wounded than you are as a black person. So I kind of pointed out that the facts don't seem to support this. And of course, that also was in and of itself just questioning the narrative, just wanting to know what does the data, what do the facts at hand seem to say about this. That in and of itself was evidence of racism and of white supremacy. And some of these people identify as anti racists. But if you're going to prescribe to someone a collective sin based upon race or skin color as the only ingredient in the mix, and to imply that certain qualities such as, bigotry or racism are essentially inherent in one race, the white one, and to hold you collectively responsible for that racism based upon group membership in a race, irrespective of how you as an individual actually operate in the world, that definition in and of itself or that way of thinking in of itself is as close to pure racism as you can get. So very often it seems as if few are more racist in their orientation and thinking than the self-identified anti-racists. In the same way that many of those who claim to be the exact opposite of the Nazis very often have more in common with them than not. I'm not implying that most socialists today are Nazis, but what I am saying is that Hitler was actually a socialist and he ran a socialist party. If you look at these things, take a look today at the people who often talk the most about diversity and tolerance. Well, these are very often the first people who want to restrict other people's freedom of speech and who advocate for very strict hate speech laws. Now, of course, they don't really have any problem with hate speech. They want to ban the speech that they find hateful. And it's often puzzling how confident they are that if they're willing to grant a state the authority to um, convict people based upon hate speech, why they assume that it would necessarily be what they deemed as hate speech that would be prosecuted as hate speech. Of course, pragmatically, it would be what the government powers at hand deemed hate speech that would be prohibited as, right? So again, these people who want these hate speech laws and want limitations on speech, well, it's only a matter before someone else whose political views you despise get to power. That means that you have to grant people who you despise, whose views you may hate, the right to deem your protests and your objections as hate speech. So I don't know anyone, for example, of these social justice warriors who want to ban speech, who say they want to ban hate speech, who say that, look, they would be comfortable allowing a person like Donald Trump at his own whims to classify their speech and objections as hate speech and to prosecute them for the crime of hate. So anyone who won't sign up for that is either incapable of principled thinking or quite simply a hypocrite. When I look at spiritual communities where there is much talk about love and unity and oneness, um, I think that um, I found more, rudeness and narcissism and lack of basic decency in many of those so-called spiritual communities than I do among people who don't claim to have such, highfalutin deals. Um, it's a bit like with clients, some of the people I work with who have been environmental activists and who talk the most about saving the environment and sacrificing. very often seem to be people who want to rule the world. They often, not always, but often seem to be driven by power, and some of them seem to be like communal narcissists, some of the most narcissistic people that you could ever find anywhere. Now, of course, some people who take a stand for things do walk the talk quite a bit. They're pretty consistent, even if we all have shadow sides. But during these times of collective darkness and a lot of polarization, it might be a good idea if all of us took a look at ourselves and looked to see if we could find in ourselves and own whatever we projected onto the world. And to also see if we could see some of the stuff that we identify as us, as the good person, as the hero in the story. See if we can find that in the people we deem as bad. I'll give you a final example of this. I used to be a reality self-defense teacher. I used to run my own classes, and since I've always been into hypnosis and NLP and stuff like that, I would often have these classes on fear management, self-hypnosis, and stuff like that. And I remember teaching, this is 20 years ago, pretty exactly 20 years ago. I taught a class, and I was teaching that perception was fundamentally projection. That whatever you see out there is a reflection of your own thought process. And a guy like really objected and said, "I'm not a Nazi," and he was so intense about it, like that was something he absolutely was not. And a couple of years ago, let's say 17 or 18 years later, he came to see me as a client with a chronic pain problem. And we got to talk, and he mentioned to me that he had joined a Nazi movement. And instead of condemning him and getting defensive, I got very curious and very present with him and did my best to understand how he fundamentally saw things. And what I discovered was that I had way more in common with him than was different. He had a love for his kids, as do I. I shared many of the same concerns that he did with immigration from the Muslim world, for example, and what's happening in Europe and in European societies. I agreed on a lot of that. What I did not agree with was the Nazi ideology and the kind of Nazi solutions to it. As I said previously, my preferences are way more libertarian. But I could see that fundamentally we had way more in common than we were different. And he fundamentally viewed himself as good. And I viewed myself as fundamentally. And that might be the problem. It's a bit like, if I had a dollar for every time a client has told me that their ex-partner is a narcissist or a psychopath, well, I wouldn't be rich, as the cliche goes, but it's happened very often. And of course, we all have some of these tendencies, some more than others. And it might be the case that some of these partners have a lot of these tendencies. It might very much be the case. And it would also be a good idea if you labeled someone else in that way to see what am I getting out of perceiving someone else in that way? Because by projecting onto someone else the role of the narcissist or the psychopath, very often a way of making them all bad. And then you get to become all good. You get to become completely right. You know, you get to be the victim. And the biggest victim, the hero in the story by being the biggest victim. So by talking with this former student of mine, I don't know. to what extent, if at all, I was able to help him kind of modify or lose belief in the Nazi ideology. But I'm happy to report that his chronic pain went away. And at least that's something, right? And of course, the less in pain you are, the more you might clear up your thinking, and vice versa. So I hope some of these reflections were useful. Oh, by the way, let me say this too: that the fact that you do, resonate with something in a negative way, in some ways, is maybe more evolved than just indifference and apathy. So, for example, someone who's quite immature and operates at lower stages of psychological development, if you mention to that person principles or conscious business or ethics in business, they may just laugh at you because it's all about like whoever pays the most money. And how can I get the most? And it's often all about appearances and more money and a bigger car and these sorts of things. But if you evolve psychologically and ethically, you might begin to get more disturbed about how you're actually making a living, what you're contributing to as a human being. Now, these are also your projections and values, but these signs of disturbance, if handled skillfully, are a sign of greater psychological development, or at least can be. And then the ideal is to get to a place where you can act on those values from a clear space, from a clear thinking mind and an open heart. The integral philosopher Ken Wilber used to say that 70% of the world are Nazis for all practical purposes. And he linked this to psychological development, that ethnocentric morality, where it's us against them. It's my duty, right or wrong. It's my religion, my in group that should have special privileges, against this sort of outgroup. My country, my race, my religion, my ideology, my tribe of right thinking peers, or even my profession should rule the world or set the boundaries. And you can see this if you look at some of the experiments in obedience. Stanley Milgram's classic experiments, which you have probably heard of, where he was looking for what made the good German. And he discovered that he found good Germans all over the United States and also in Europe, where he would create this mock situation where one person had the opportunity to punish someone else who was making mistakes, and they framed the whole thing as an experiment to see how punishment would influence learning and memory retention. And during the experiments, of course, no one actually got hurt. It was a sham, but the actor would fake getting hurt. And over 60% of the participants would kill the other participant when ordered to do so by an authority figure, by someone in a white lab jacket who quite simply said that you have to continue. The experiment demands that you continue. And in this context, there's not a gun to your head. There's no risk. Not even that. So few people seem to even, you know, consider that the whole thing might be a sham. The whole thing might be deceptive. Our tendency to believe in authority is that great. Or the Salomon Ash obedience experiments where people look at two different sticks, where one is actually longer than the other, and where everyone says when you ask them in isolation which stick or line is the longest, everyone chooses the same one. But if you put people in a context where nine actors say that the shortest one is the longest one, before they ask you, about 70% then go along with that. And these are regular people. These are regular people in recent times in a academic setting where there's no gun to your head and no consequence, right? Being that willing to obey to authority. Most people want big government, big state, whether it's so-called left or right, and are very comfortable in using violence or state-based coercion to force their ideals onto others. Most people want a state that punishes what they don't like and which subsidizes what they want. They want free speech for themselves and they want to restrict other speech, right? So this in peaceful times. Now imagine economic hardship, massive turbulence, and we are this close, most of us, from being prison guards in Auschwitz. And I think that as long as we pretend otherwise, and we're not willing to look at ourselves and deal with our own psychology and our own projections, there's little chance that we might evolve beyond that in the near future. And our future may very well depend upon it. So I hope this was useful. Till next time.